This is an analysis from Alpha Business Media. Welcome to today's deep dive. I'm so glad you're joining us because we have a genuinely fascinating stack of sources to go through today.
We really do.
Yeah, we are looking at excerpts from a comprehensive economic analysis titled Beyond Tourism, a New Pivot for Nepal's Economic Reform. And our mission today is to explore a proposition that feels, well, it feels incredibly radical when you first hear it.
Oh, absolutely.
We're going to look at how a country globally famous for its breathtaking tourism, we're talking Mount Everest, the Himalayas, the ultimate bucket list destination, might actually be held back by that very industry.
It's a huge shift in perspective.
Exactly. We're going to explore why true economic sovereignty for Nepal might require tossing out the glossy tourist brochures altogether and focusing entirely on a hidden, highly unglamorous asset. So whether you are an economics nerd, a business strategist prepping for a meeting, or just someone insanely curious about how nations actually build lasting wealth, this deep dive is going to completely flip your understanding of how national branding can sometimes become a massive economic trap.
It really is a paradigm-shifting document. I mean, we're so accustomed to the narrative that tourism is the ultimate golden ticket for developing nations blessed with natural beauty.
Right.
But this analysis strips away the romanticism entirely. It looks purely at the macroeconomic data and structural foundations, and it challenges us to look past the branding and ask what actually builds a resilient, shock-proof economy.
Now, before we get deep into the proposed legislative solutions like the National Hydropower Export Infrastructure Act or the text's critiques of current government resource allocation, I want to make it absolutely clear to you, the listener, that we are simply unpacking the arguments presented in this specific analysis.
Yeah, it's crucial.
We aren't taking political sides here, and we certainly aren't endorsing these specific government policies or critiques. We are merely exploring the author's economic blueprint to understand the mechanics of their argument.
That is an important distinction to keep in mind, because the author is advocating for a massive structural overhaul of a national economy, which inherently involves navigating incredibly complex political and social realities.
Okay, let's unpack this. The analysis starts by contrasting the facade of the tourism industry with the structural reality. We all know the imagery. If you've ever seen a travel ad for Nepal, it's the colorful prayer flags fluttering against an impossibly blue sky, trekkers on ancient trails, the vibrant, bustling streets of Themel in Kathmandu.
The classic postcard view.
Exactly. Campaigns like Visit Nepal or Naturally Nepal, Once Is Not Enough, are incredibly successful at creating a brand. It's the story the country tells the world. But the reality underneath the surface is painting a very different picture.
The author draws a really sharp contrast between that beautiful imagery and the national economic dashboards, which are essentially flashing red. The analysis describes the tourism economy in Nepal not as a solid foundation for growth, but rather as a fiscal sugar high and ultimately a strategic liability.
A strategic liability is a heavy phrase for an industry that brings in so many people. Why does the text go that far?
It comes down to intense volatility. Tourism, by its very nature in this mountainous region, is overwhelmingly seasonal.
Right, the weather dictates everything.
Exactly. You have these massive boom and bust cycles dictated almost entirely by two very narrow trekking windows. You have the spring window from March to May and the autumn window from September to November in regions like the Khumbu and Annapurna.
So, for the other 6 or 7 months of the year, immense amounts of capital hotels, restaurants, specialized transport, and human labor just lay completely underutilized.
Which is not the rhythm of a modern, stable economy, as the text puts it. It's the rhythm of an agrarian society applied to the service sector. You harvest your cash when the weather is right, and you survive on those reserves for the rest of the year.
And it isn't just the seasonality that makes it a liability, right? It's the sheer vulnerability to external shocks that are completely out of the nation's control.
Yes.
The sources spend a lot of time highlighting the 2015 earthquake, various geopolitical tensions in the region, and of course the ultimate stress test for this model, COVID-19.
The pandemic provides the starkest data point in the entire analysis. When global travel stopped, Nepal saw an 80% drop in international arrivals. That wiped out an estimated $1 billion in revenue almost overnight.
Wow.
Think about the human impact of that macroeconomic data. Trails were empty, gear shops boarded up, and thousands of guides and hospitality workers simply lost their livelihoods because an international flight schedule was suspended.
When a nation's GDP is that deeply tied to global whims, the author argues that you aren't really managing an economy. You are essentially rolling the dice every single year.
That's spot on.
A finance minister cannot build a robust 10-year infrastructure plan on the hope that European or American tourists will feel comfortable spending their discretionary income on trekking next autumn.
It makes long-term infrastructural planning nearly impossible. The fragility is built into the business model itself.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Even during the good years, when the tourists actually do show up and spend money, that money doesn't circulate the way we traditionally assume it does.
Not at all.
I always thought, and I think most people assume, that tourism has this massive multiplier effect. A tourist spends $1 at a local hotel. The hotel pays the cleaning staff, the staff buys local groceries, and the whole local economy lifts. But the sources completely dismantled this myth of the multiplier effect.
They dismantle it using a critical economic concept called import leakage.
Import leakage.
Right. The reality of modern international tourism is that high-end hotels, specialized trekking agencies, and the restaurants in the tourist hubs are catering to very specific international tastes and standards.
Let's do a quick I'm 5 on import leakage. Walk us through the journey of a $100 bill spent by a tourist in Kathmandu.
Sure. Let's say a tourist drops $100 at a boutique lodge. A significant chunk of that $100 is immediately used by the lodge owner to restock. They are buying imported premium fuels to run their backup generators, Swiss chocolates for the turn-down service, Irish whiskey for the bar, specialized climbing gear manufactured abroad, and luxury finishing materials for the lodge itself. Within days, $80 or $90 of that original 100 has crossed the border again to pay foreign suppliers.
So that dollar doesn't actually stimulate a local factory in a domestic industrial hub like Hatada.
Exactly.
It completely bypasses the domestic manufacturing base and ends up stimulating a factory in China or India or Europe where those goods were produced. The net benefit to the local economy is incredibly shallow.
The data really backs that up. The author contrasts this dynamic with a traditional industrial project. If a nation invests $1 in building a domestic cement factory, that dollar pays local construction wages. It is used to buy local limestone. It utilizes local transportation networks.
The money stays local.
Exactly. And the final product, the cement, is then used to build more domestic infrastructure. The economic multiplier is high, and the leakage is minimal. The central argument here is that by focusing so heavily on promoting tourism, Nepal has misallocated its political and financial capital into an industry with one of the least effective mechanisms for broad-based wealth creation.
Which brings us to a rather dark paradox highlighted in the text. Industrial stagnation and a phenomenon they call deindustrialization by default.
Yeah.
The numbers provided are honestly staggering. Nepal's manufacturing contribution to its overall GDP has slipped below 5%.
The author notes that 5% is a number fitting a pre-industrial nation. It's certainly not a nation actively trying to reach middle-income status and lift millions out of poverty.
And the analysis blames this specifically on a concept called policy schizophrenia. How does the text define that?
It describes the ongoing tug of war in how capital flows through the country. Capital, much like water, always follows the path of least resistance. Building a manufacturing base is incredibly hard. It requires navigating dense bureaucratic red tape, reforming labor laws, and enduring a very long horizon before you see any return on investment. On the flip side, you have massive amounts of remittance money sent back home from Nepalese working abroad, flowing into the country every single day.
And what happens to that remittance money?
It floods the banking system and artificially inflates the real estate market, particularly in the Kathmandu Valley. Land prices skyrocket.
So if you are a local investor with capital to deploy, you're looking at the landscape and thinking, why on earth would I go through the headache of building a steel plant or a garment factory, dealing with supply chains and labor disputes, when I can just buy a plot of land in Kathmandu, hold on to it for a year, and flip it for a massive guaranteed profit? The incentive structure is totally warped.
It creates a hollow economy. While the national conversation is heavily dominated by launching new tourism campaigns and managing those remittance flows, actual industrial policy is entirely neglected. The government hasn't actively decided to shut down factories. They have simply allowed the conditions for their survival to wither away.
And the most critical condition that has withered, according to the sources, is energy. This part of the analysis blew my mind. The text states that Nepal has 42,000 megawatts of commercially viable hydropower potential. That is an oceanic, almost incomprehensible amount of clean energy. Yet, local domestic industries face some of the highest electricity tariffs in South Asia and deal with chronic instability. How is that possible?
Decades, there simply was no strategic energy policy aligned with industrialization. And the text provides an important analogy here. Energy is not just a commodity. It is the circulatory system of an industrial economy.
Blood pumping through the veins.
Exactly. You can have the best workers and the best factories, so if you don't have blood pumping through the system, nothing works.
The text mentions the history of load shedding. For listeners unfamiliar with the term, this refers to rolling scheduled blackouts. We aren't talking about a power flicker during a storm. We're talking about the grid being intentionally turned off for hours at a time because there simply isn't enough electricity to go around. You cannot run a 21st century manufacturing plant when the power cuts out every Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon.
The lack of reliable, cheap energy infrastructure essentially acts as a massive, non-tariff barrier to domestic growth. Without it, competing with the massive, hyper-efficient economies of scale in neighboring China or India is mathematically impossible.
And the human cost of this structural failure is tragic. Because the industries aren't there, the jobs aren't there. The sources paint this incredibly vivid picture of the current reality. You have young, brilliant engineers who should be at home designing state-of-the-art hydropower tunnels in the Himalayas, but instead they are supervising construction sites in Dubai or Doha. You have skilled technicians who should be running automated factory floors in Nepal, but they are working long shifts in manufacturing plants in Malaysia.
The text uses a specific demographic term here. They are exporting their demographic dividend.
Let's clarify that term because it's central to the author's urgency.
A demographic dividend is a specific temporary window in a nation's history where the proportion of the working-age population is significantly larger than the non-working age share, meaning children and the elderly.
It's the economic sweet spot.
Yes, the sweet spot for rapid economic growth. But if you don't have domestic industries to absorb those workers, they leave. You miss the window entirely, and a nation runs the risk of growing old before it ever grows rich.
The author delivers a profoundly sobering insight regarding this brain drain. They state that the remittances these overseas workers send home are not some sort of economic gift to the nation. They are the invoice for our failure to create a productive domestic economy. They are paying for today's consumption by sacrificing the future of their youth.
It is an incredibly powerful way to reframe a metric that is often celebrated by politicians. Rising remittances shouldn't be cheered. They should be viewed as a symptom of industrial failure.
So, the diagnosis laid out in the analysis is brutal but clear. The tourism sugar high is volatile and leaky, the industrial base is starved of energy and capital, and the youth are leaving. But the sources don't just point out the problems. They offer a massive, radical pivot. It is time to stop viewing hydropower merely as a domestic utility, just something to keep the lights on, and start reconceptualizing water as a premier strategic export commodity. We're talking about viewing Himalayan water the way Saudi Arabia views oil, or Qatar views natural gas.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the geographic and geopolitical positioning of Nepal makes this pivot not just mathematically possible, but absolutely imperative. The text points directly to the Bhutan model as the ultimate proof of concept.
I was fascinated by this comparison. Bhutan is a neighboring, landlocked Himalayan nation that faced very similar geographic and economic choices, but they took a completely different path.
They resisted the temptation of mass tourism. Instead, Bhutan made a deliberate state-led bet on building massive hydroelectric dams and exporting the surplus power directly to India.
The numbers the author provides on Bhutan are incredible. Electricity sales now make up over 20% of Bhutan's entire GDP, and a staggering 40% of their national revenue. That single, stable source of income is what funds their free healthcare system, their free education system, and provides the government with a massive fiscal surplus. And the raw potential of Nepal dwarfs Bhutan's. As we mentioned, Nepal is sitting on 42,000 megawatts of potential.
Exactly, and look at the market demand sitting right across their borders.
Yeah.
You have India to the south, whose energy demand is projected to double by 2030 as they industrialize further. And slightly further south, you have Bangladesh, a rapidly growing nation of 170 million people, desperately seeking to diversify its energy grid away from expensive imported fossil fuels.
It's the perfect match.
Nepal is physically sitting on the exact clean energy solution to the biggest economic bottlenecks of two giant neighbors.
But the mechanism to actually capture this value is very specific. The text focuses on something called a PPA, a power purchase agreement. The sources stress the financial magic of a PPA when compared to something like a tourism marketing campaign. Walk us through why a PPA completely changes the math for a national economy.
A 25-year power purchase agreement is essentially an ironclad, long-term contract to sell a specific amount of electricity to a buyer at a predetermined set price. Unlike tourism revenue, which ebbs and flows with trekking seasons, global pandemics, or recessions in Europe, a PPA provides guaranteed, non-cyclical, dollar-denominated revenue.
It effectively decouples a massive chunk of the nation's GDP from the whims of global events.
Precisely. A finance minister can look at a signed PPA and know exactly how much foreign currency is going to enter the national treasury on the first of every month for the next quarter century. You can build sovereign wealth funds on that kind of predictability. You can issue bonds against it to underwrite your own domestic industrialization. You simply cannot do any of that with speculative tourist arrival numbers.
It's the difference between hoping foot traffic wanders into your retail store versus having a guaranteed 25-year enterprise subscription from your biggest corporate client. But the author is very clear that getting there isn't going to be easy. The sources outline a literal fork in the road for the country over the next 24 to 36 months, presenting two very distinct scenarios. The first is what they call the muddle-through approach.
The muddle-through scenario is the path of least resistance. It's maintaining the status quo. The government continues to launch flashy new tourism slogans, celebrates when the remittance numbers tick up, and incrementally adds a few megawatts to the domestic grid here and there.
But the structural vulnerability remains completely unaddressed. The country stays at the mercy of global shocks, the currency stays weak, and that critical brain drain accelerates. As the author notes, in this scenario, the best and brightest youth will continue to see their futures not in Kathmandu, but in Sydney, London, or Dallas. It's a future of managed decline that is occasionally masked by a really good tourist season.
And the alternative scenario is the strategic pivot. This requires a radical structural shift in policy focus. The sources actually propose a specific legislative solution, a National Hydropower Export Infrastructure Act.
National Hydropower Export Infrastructure Act. Try saying that 3 times fast. But despite the clunky name, this is essentially the break glass in case of emergency solution, isn't it? The details they argue for are intense. They want a single-window clearance system for export-oriented projects, specifically massive projects over 100 or 200 megawatts that dedicate 80% of their power to export. Why is that single-window clearance so crucial to getting this done?
This raises an important question about bureaucratic bottlenecks. Currently, an international investor trying to build a major infrastructure project in Nepal has to navigate a labyrinth of different ministries. The Ministry of Environment, Forestry, Energy, Land Reform. It can take years just to get the paperwork stamped.
Which scares off capital.
Right. A single window system with the overriding authority to bypass individual ministry delays would make investing in Nepal as seamless as investing in a factory in Bangladesh. It sends a clear signal to global capital markets that the country is seriously open for business in this specific sector.
The proposed act also calls for granting eminent domain authority to build high-voltage direct current or HVDC energy highways. Let's break that down. Eminent domain means the government has the legal authority to force the sale of private land for public use. And they need this land to build these HVDC lines.
Yes.
Think of HVDC lines not as your standard wooden power poles, but as massive, ultra-efficient bullet trains for electricity that can travel hundreds of miles without losing power. You can generate all the power you want in the high Himalayas, but if you don't have these massive transmission corridors to transport that electricity down to the Indian and Bangladeshi borders, the dams are useless.
And to fund the construction of these transmission bullet trains, the sources emphasize utilizing domestic capital, specifically funds like the Employee Provident Fund and the Citizen Investment Trust. The logic here is that the immense wealth generated by these projects should stay in the country, paying dividends to Nepali citizens rather than just enriching foreign developers.
But the authors are very clear-eyed about the reality of executing this. They dedicate a section to what they call the hard truth. This pivot is politically arduous.
Incredibly arduous. Building massive transmission corridors requires contentious land acquisition battles. Utilizing eminent domain is politically toxic almost anywhere in the world. Furthermore, executing this vision requires complex, sustained diplomatic negotiations with a massive, powerful neighbor like India.
It is vastly less glamorous than hosting a glittering tourism investment summit in a 5-star hotel in Kathmandu. You are dealing with concrete, copper wire, land rights, environmental impact studies, and heavy engineering instead of marketing slogans and cultural showcases. The tourism lobby is well established, highly visible, and politically influential. To pivot national resources away from that requires a level of sustained political discipline that the sources admit is largely alien to the country's recent history.
But the core argument of the entire analysis is that true economic strategy must be guided by structural data, not by national sentiment or brand identity. The transition from a romanticized identity built around trekking and mountains to a pragmatic industrial identity built around being a reliable regional energy powerhouse is undeniably difficult. But the math suggests it is the only viable path to genuine macroeconomic stability.
So, what does this all mean? If we synthesize the core argument from all these sources, it really comes down to this. The marketing slogan of Visit Nepal is a pleasantry, it's a hope. But a 25-year power purchase agreement for 5,000 megawatts of electricity is a sovereign financial instrument. It is a tangible, bankable balance sheet asset. The ultimate choice for the nation is whether to continue selling its scenery, which keeps it trapped in an endless cycle of volatility, or to do the hard, deeply unglamorous work of building a structural economic engine using its water.
And for our listeners, regardless of what industry or country you work in, this deep dive serves as a phenomenal masterclass in strategic analysis. It demonstrates perfectly how relying on your most visible, highly branded asset, in this case the Himalayas and the tourism they attract, can actually blind you to your most structurally sound, yet ignored, foundational strengths. It is a powerful lesson in distinguishing between what looks good on a glossy brochure and what actually creates resilient, compounding value over decades.
It really is. And that leads me to a final, entirely new thought I want to leave you with today, building on everything we've discussed. We've talked about Nepal's potential pivot, but it makes you wonder about the broader global transition to green energy. For the last century, geopolitical power was largely dictated by who happened to have oil and natural gas under their sand or soil.
Right, the geographic lottery.
Exactly. But as the world frantically moves away from fossil fuels, those geographical lotteries are changing. If a landlocked, economically struggling nation like Nepal can theoretically become a regional energy superpower simply by harnessing its topography and gravity, what other ignored countries out there are sitting on the green energy gold mines of tomorrow? Who are the new geopolitical heavyweights of the 21st century that we aren't even paying attention to yet? It's a fascinating shift to keep an eye on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We will be back soon with another stack of sources to unpack together. Until next time, keep questioning the consensus.